Good morning. This is the lecture for Ancient Medieval History for Wednesday, the 18th of May, 2022. And we are beginning with cathedrals. Now, a cathedral is not like any other structure. First of all, a cathedral isn't merely a house of worship. It is the distinct form of architecture of the High Middle Ages in Western Europe. No one else builds cathedrals. The Taj Mahal is a beautiful temple. It's not a cathedral. The Temple of Abu Simbel, not a cathedral. Focus. Because when it's distracting me, it's distracting others. Good job. A cathedral is the official church of a bishop, or an archbishop, or a cardinal. A cathedral is a church that brings people in from all over for big ceremonies. It's the equivalent of a city to a bunch of towns, towns being normal churches. But during the time when we shift from Romanesque to Gothic cathedrals, this is when the form of architecture really begins to shine. There is talk of walls of glass supporting heavy roofs, almost like magic. This is something that the Byzantines never came up with. It's something that the Hagia Sophia is not. It's something that the Romans or the Greeks or the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Indians, and the Chinese never came up with. It is a particular architecture form for Western Europe. And another thing about cathedrals is they take usually at least a century to build. In the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon for a city or a town's major project for close to 200 years is that cathedral. Now, in modern times, you can build a cathedral more quickly. But there is a particular cathedral in Barcelona, Catalonia, Spain, called La Sagrada Familia. La Sagrada Familia, the Holy Family, is a cathedral that was begun in the 1920s and 30s by the Catalan architect Antonio Gaudí. And its construction was stopped in 1936 by the Spanish Civil War. It was only begun again in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Now, Gaudí's architecture is unusual. It's a mixture of Gothic and organic. When Gaudí built a building, it's almost like the building grew rather than was constructed. It's almost like the forms were alive. He used lots of curves and lots of organic shapes and forms. In the more modern parts of the church, of the cathedral, the art styles chosen by the people around the year 2000 tended to be different in that they were much more angular, much sharper. They were also odd, weird, but whether they fit or not is an interesting question. Because the older cathedrals, even though they took a long time to build, tended to have a common aesthetic, whereas La Sagrada Familia didn't. So I'm going to play for you a couple of videos about this modern cathedral to give you an idea of what is still going on today in some places. So some of the things you will have noticed, there are times in The Lord of the Rings and the other books Tolkien wrote where he wrote about elvish construction. Cities like Menengroth in the First Age and the Elven King's Hall in the Third. And what they're supposed to be are huge interior spaces that are meant to look like forests, but they're made of stone. That interior, with its columns that branch out like trees to support a roof that looks a bit like a bank of leaves above, is the closest thing I've ever seen to that being done in reality. And that is very much in the spirit of Gaudi. Gaudi wanted his buildings to look alive, not like his work is the opposite of the hyper-angular, hyper-unadorned, hyper-plain international style of architecture that becomes so popular in the mid to late 20th century. And what I see, because I know the church, and what you may have seen, is a mixture of the rounded forms of Gaudi, like those four beehive towers, with this very angular sort of modern, postmodern archway that's built in front of them, where you have a statue of Jesus sitting on a ledge, and the Jesus looks like an experiment in geometrical forms making a human body. I suppose somebody thinks that works, because at the very least it's not classical, it's not traditional architecture. But it is, to me, a clash. In any event, this cathedral apparently took 137 years to build. That's a long time. So I guess it was started before the 1920s. I guess it was started around 1900, maybe even before. Now, let's compare this to a more classical cathedral, the classic cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris, which had a disaster about a year ago. So, in Notre Dame de Paris, which is Our Lady of Paris, in the real life, the interior space is still vast, but you can see it is much more heavily built. And this is because Notre Dame de Paris was one of the first Gothic cathedrals. So, let me explain some differences. What had preceded Gothic cathedrals were Romanesque. And Romanesque cathedrals tended to be very thick-walled, with very small windows. Because the weight of the roof is carried by the walls themselves. You might have a domed roof, you might have columns inside, but basically it is a building that is like a invertebrate with an exoskeleton. The building is supported by the walls. Therefore, the walls have to be thick. Therefore, the windows cannot be too large, and therefore, light is going to come through a variety of small windows and maybe some openings up near the dome, and that's about it, except for candles. Now, these tend to be beautiful buildings. You usually have a basilica and the rest of the church. The basilica is where the king would sit. It's where the altar is. And you've got columns, and you've got people standing or sitting in the church. Gothic cathedrals, on the other hand, which are the ones that we're talking about, the classic architecture of the Middle Ages, still have heavy roofs. They don't necessarily have domes the way the Romanesque churches do, but they have these beautiful, beautiful vaulted roofs made of wood covered with lead, because lead will slough the water off, and it's cheap. But say you've got this beautiful roof. It's not going to float up there. We don't yet have anti-gravity devices in the Middle Ages. And yet, what the architects managed to do is they managed to make walls that have huge spaces for windows. I mean, sometimes the windows are floor to ceiling, up to the base of the roof. Sometimes you have sections of windows that have a structure, but basically they're not going to support any weight. So you have walls of glass that let in light and that color the light. Now, stained glass, I don't know if you ever made stained glass when you were in elementary school art class or high school art class, but it's kind of neat. And you can do all sorts of interesting things with it. You usually use, in the Middle Ages, you would use lead as your metal to connect the different pieces of glass. And the different pieces of glass are different shapes and colors. And what they do is they make a picture. It's not like a mosaic where all the pieces are little cubes or little squares. You can have a stained glass window that has, the shape of a saint or the shape of Jesus or the shape of Mary, like you would see in a comic book or a cartoon. It usually is somewhat stylized cartoonish because you're building out of light.
What's cool is, so there's a church that I went to, St. Thomas, downtown Coeur d'Alene, and then there's the Boise Cathedral down in Boise. And they have similar glass windows, but the ones in Boise, the color was actually put into the glass as in...
That's the best way, I think. Well, glazed, maybe.
Glazed. Yeah. I was going to say blown. But the one at St. Thomas has been painted on top, so they have to sometimes fix it.
That's interesting. Most of the stained glass I've seen was made as stained glass. St. Thomas is it a newer church?
No.
That's interesting.
It's a little over 100 years old now.
Okay. Well, it's possible they did the glass on the cheap in that sense. And I'm not trying to insult it. It sounds insulting, I suppose. But my understanding is that pretty much all the Gothic cathedrals are going to use colored glass, which the medieval people did know how to make.
Yeah, because I think they would make like individual shapes of glass, and they'd use like some of those windows are like 10 to like 15,000 pieces of like individual pieces of glass, and they just put them together and just slowly solder it together, and it's an image.
Yeah.
And then from there.
No, and that's how it works. So usually what you almost never will see that. That's interesting. I've never heard of that before. Anyway, how can you do this? It's not magic. So here's how. What you build out from the walls are a series of columns. These columns can be tall and thin. They can be straight or they can have an angle to them. But these columns are going to be connected to the roof by what are called flying buttresses. And what these flying buttresses do is they carry the weight away from the walls to these columns. So you can have a cathedral that seems to have glazed walls, huge sections of the wall are open glass. And the reason you can have that is because out beyond the glass, beyond the stained glass windows where you can't really see, are a series of columns. And what these columns do is they actually carry the weight of the church. Now, a Gothic cathedral will also tend to have a basilica where the king would go. It's from the Greek word basileus for king. You've got your altar. But a Gothic cathedral also will tend to be cruciform. In other words, it will tend to have galleries that go out and off to the side. And this is both to represent the cross of Christ from the air, not that anyone can fly in those days, well, more than once, but it's also a way of fitting more people close to the altar. Now, opposite the basilica, on this wall, is where you typically have the rose window. Now, there can be many round windows in a cathedral, but the rose window is sort of opposite to the altar. And it is massive, round, intricate, Sometimes it's called the rose window because sometimes it's the pattern of a rose. It usually tells its own story, but it gives balance to all of the crosses and the light in the basilica. So you've got something back here that also gives light. Inside the cathedral, you do have columns, like a forest of them. But these columns are not usually such that they block too many views of the altar. A few people are going to get lousy places. But at first, there are no pews. In the cathedral, you stand and you kneel. You stand and you kneel. Only later, in more modern times, do Catholics and others put in pews where you can sit and kneel and sit and kneel. So at first, they didn't have to worry about seats. People would just move so that the columns are not in the way. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah. I think there's, I don't know what, but there's like a type of cathedral, maybe not a cathedral, but it's a fairly large building made of almost entirely of stone. Mm-hmm. And the architect said, people kept telling him you have to put in like internal stone columns to help support the weight. And then he said, no, we don't need those because all the weight will be supported by the walls and everything else. So he, but everyone insisted, and so he said, fine, I'll put in the columns. But he put the columns in so that there's a gap, like an inch, just an inch at the top, so they don't actually touch anything, and so they're not actually supporting anything. So all of the weight is just supported by the walls. So if you can you take like a drone up there or something like that, not like a camera, but it's just this 1 inch gap all the way across.
That's hilarious. If you find out where, send me a link. I'd be interested in learning more. That's an incredibly good story. Architects usually know their stuff. Now, sometimes they make mistakes. You've got the Tacoma Narrows Bridge over in Tacoma, Washington, that was built just before World War II. It was built during the Depression. And this was before we understood harmonics and vibrations and their effect on things. Tacoma Narrows was a beautiful suspension bridge, elegant, thin, long. And a suspension bridge does not have its weight supported by the deck. Its weight is supported by towers and cables, and they're beautiful things. My favorite bridge in the world, the George Washington Bridge, is a suspension bridge. Unfortunately, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was built in such a way that the harmonics absolutely matched the kind of wind that flew through there regularly. And there is a famous video. Well, actually, I'll show you the video. So mistakes can be made, as you saw there, by architects. Okay, they just didn't understand. The history of aeronautics is filled with mistakes that are made until people understand new principles. But, for the most part, these cathedrals are the largest and tallest structures in Europe, including most of the Roman stuff, up until modern industrial times like the building of the Eiffel Tower. There isn't a single powered tool used in any of it. It's all hand-worked. Hand drills, hand saws, the cutting of stone, the carving of statues out of marble, all done by hand. Lifting these blocks of stone with cranes, all by hand, by pulling. The placing of the roof, the laying of the lead, the placing of the gargoyles around the edge. Now, at Notre Dame de Paris, the gargoyles are serpentine, demon-looking things to remind you of hell, but they're also rain gutters. So in rainstorms, you see the gargoyles disgorging rain out of their mouths. The rain comes down off the roof into the gargoyles, and it's like a fountain. This is not the product of barbarians. In the High Middle Ages, European culture is back, and it's different. It's Christian. It is Christendom. It is oriented towards faith. So, a bit like the ancient Babylonians, you have these beautiful temples surrounded by a squalor of urban sprawl inside the city walls. The walls are incredible. The cathedral is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, and the castles are also pretty darn good. But most people's homes are functional. They're made of wood. These cities are fire traps. We're going to talk more about that. Now, there's another thing about cathedrals that you need to understand. The cathedral is a place where the best, most knowledgeable people in the area will tend to gather because there's work for them there. If you understand the maths, you can get a job at a cathedral working with the architect. If you understand how to carve stone, if you understand history and theology and can help the artists produce statues of saints that are accurate and depictions in the stained glass that are in conformity with the beliefs of the church, you can get a job there. And so the cathedrals, because they attract all these high energy, high talent, high education people, have schools for their children where sometimes these people teach. And it is cathedral schools, the schools for the children of people who are making the cathedral over a century of time and more, that become the basis of the universities, which is another product of medieval Europe. A university system, which we're going to talk about a little more in the future. Now, any questions, comments, or thoughts on cathedral? Okay. We're now going to shift back to the Pope versus the kings and emperor. The Pope is God's chief human for the faith, the vicar of Christ. That's what the church believes in the Middle Ages. That's what everyone believes in Christendom. But each king is appointed by God and crowned in a coronation ceremony that is absolutely priestly, absolutely religious, where the king accepts the responsibility of reigning in Christ's name and ruling in nomine Deus, in the name of God, over an area to protect it for the faithful. You can't be in two places at once. And you can't. Sorry. Let me say that again. You can't be in two places at once. You can't. That was a little special effect I did for the people at home. I will pop from one side of the screen to the other. It'll blow people's minds. Anyway, the idea is you can't have two supreme rulers of the same people in the same area. So whose cuisine will reign supreme? Whose authority is the mostest, the bestest, the topsest? Is it the Pope, who's in charge of the church, or is it the king or the emperor who's in charge of the state? They both can't be supreme. Now, here's the secret. They both shouldn't be trying to be supreme. That's Christ's job. They should each do their job, which is to run their thing. The Pope runs the international church, including the church in our country. The king runs the government of our country. The Pope has his job, run the church, help the people's souls. The king has his job, run the government, keep the country strong. They're not exactly the same job. In fact, they're supposed to work hand in glove, like a hand in a glove, together. But they don't. So, the Investiture Controversy. That's a question of who gets to appoint the bishops in a particular region. In England, we talked about this with King John. The Pope has this crazy idea that since he's the head of the international church, he should appoint the bishops, who are the leaders of the church, everywhere. And the kings say, well, not in my domain. I want people I can work with. I want people I can trust. I want people who aren't going to undermine my authority. I want partners. So I want to appoint the bishops. After all, don't I know the people in my region better than you all the way over in Rome? And the Pope says, don't I know my own people? After all, I'm the one that supervised their training. I'm their supervisor. Don't I know them better? So the kings and emperors on the one hand and the Pope on the other have hundreds of years of struggle over who gets to appoint the bishops. You want to hear one of the more shameful compromises that are made over this? Today, Pope Francis, liberation theologian and former Jesuit, left-wing Catholic priest, becomes Pope in a very questionable move against Pope Benedict. Francis agrees to allow the Communist Party of China to have final decision over who becomes bishop over the Roman Catholic Church, bishops over the Roman Catholic Church in China. Now, let me point out, number one, the Communist Party of China is officially atheistic. They consider all this God stuff to be nothing but a trickery to keep people in line. Number two, the Chinese Communist Party has its own church. Yep, the atheist Communist Party of China runs a Christian church. Because if anyone's going to worship anything in China, communists must control it. This is like the Buddhist law that says you cannot reincarnate without the proper paperwork from the Chinese Communist Party. The Communist Party of China will not recognize you being reborn into another soul. For real. So Pope Francis, he's got his own decision-making process. I'm not a Roman Catholic anymore. I don't have any right to talk about him as if he's betrayed my trust, except I love the Catholic Church. Pope Francis agreed to allow the Chinese Communist Party to decide who's going to be a bishop and an archbishop and a cardinal within the People's Republic of China.
You don't understand, Mr. Ginordio. They have a lot of money.
Oh, okay. Anywho, so this problem of whether the kings or the bishops or the Pope is going to be able to determine who the leaders of the church are in a particular area goes on and on. Ultimately, there are compromises that are reached. And actually, the kind of compromises that are reached include things like the Pope comes up with several selections, and the king gets to choose among them. That is usually what happens in Catholic countries in the late Middle Ages where they solve the Investiture Controversy. They say, okay, it's not going to be you or me, it's going to be us. We're going to come up with a way, we're going to have a limited set of choices, or the king proposes a set of choices and the Pope chooses. Usually the Pope proposes a set of choices and the king chooses. But for hundreds of years, this is a big deal. Now, part of this, by the way, has to do with something called sanctuary. Sanctuary, S-A-N-C-T-U-A-R-Y. If you know the story of the Hunchback of Notre Dame, you know about sanctuary. If you're running from the law and you don't think you did it, you can run into a cathedral or church and claim sanctuary. Because the church is part of the church, not the state. And for the longest time, government troops were not allowed into churches if the priest chose to grant sanctuary, or the bishop, or whoever. Then you have an impasse. On the one hand, the government troops are outside waiting to arrest. On the other hand, they can't go into the church because the church belongs. It's like, you know how embassies today are not the soil of the host country, they're the soil of the country whose embassy it is? So the American embassy in the Philippines is American soil. Just the property of the embassy in the Philippines. The rest of the Philippines is Filipino soil, except for all the other embassies. The Chinese embassy or the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, which is like a mini embassy, that is People's Republic of China land within the city of San Francisco. It's basically a house and a compound, but it's Chinese. And we have embassies and consulates in Beijing and Shanghai and so forth. So churches were considered like that. They were foreign soil. Now, were there times when the authorities just said, "To hell with this, we're going in"? Oh, yes, there were. But formally, the state was supposed to respect that the church was separate. This is something that also changed. You try pulling sanctuary in the United States, it's not going to work. First of all, nobody's going to grant it. The priests and bishops are not going to grant it. That's not our system. But secondly, the American system, while we permit freedom of religion, does not really permit sanctuary. That's not the agreement we have with any church, Roman Catholic or otherwise. And I think what we're going to do is leave things there with sanctuary. So, any questions, comments, or thoughts? I see none. So you may converse. Oh God, that's early. Meh. It's not 3 minutes. It's more like 6, but fine. Okay. Bye.
Isn't it more like 50,000?